You're listening to Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network. I'm Alan B. Smith. I'm your host, and join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal pit stops and tantalizing turnoffs. If you're a regular listener to IRN, we have an IRN smartphone app where you can listen live to the live stream from home, on the road, or from that greasy diner somewhere off a dusty road. The app also allows you to chat with other listeners, provides show lineups, and other information and tools. Tonight we have a fantastic guest, Kevin Randle. We will get to him in just a moment. As a friendly reminder, if you're just finding us, please like Paranormal Now on Facebook at Paranormal Now Radio or on Instagram at Paranormal Now. Brief reminder, you can also listen to IRN's 24/7 stream using Live 365, Stitcher Radio, Nobex Radio, TuneIn, iTunes Radio, Streama, Shoutcast, Winamp, WinMedia Player, QuickTime, and later you can always listen to rebroadcasts on the IRN Roku channel. I know IRN was smart to make a move to Roku because Roku is exploding fast. And if you don't have access to a computer or smartphone, you can call from your landline or cell phone to listen in for free at 401-283-6700. Again, that's 401-283-6700, and you can listen to the 24/7 live broadcast on the IRN station. This is a podcast, and as I remind every week, even though this is a regularly broadcast show, this is a podcast. So we cannot take your questions right here and now. For those who will be tuning in on Instagram Live while I'm recording this podcast, then they will be able to send in their messages. So for future shows, keep that in mind. Keep an eye on the Instagram account on Paranormal Now, and you can throw your messages towards us, and we will get them to Kevin Randle or whoever the guest may be. All right, so speaking of our guest, Kevin D. Randle, he is a former Army helicopter pilot, an Air Force intelligence officer who has been writing about the UFO phenomena for more than 25 years. He has written or co-written numerous books on the subject, including UFO Crash at Roswell, The Truth About the UFO Crash at Roswell, and A History of UFO Crashes. I'm getting a theme here, crashes and UFOs. And he has made numerous appearances on television and radio, including Good Morning America Sunday, The Larry King, UFO Special, and Unsolved Mysteries. Randle currently hosts his own radio program, The Randle Report, dealing with many kinds of mysterious phenomena, including UFOs. Randle is a full-time writer who has published more than 100 books of fiction and nonfiction. He is a former Army helicopter pilot and Air Force intelligence officer who has 4 college degrees, including a PhD in psychology. Randle is definitely considered one of the top UFO investigators, and his research into the Roswell UFO crash helped bring that sighting into prominence. He has written more than 15 books about the UFOs and other terrestrial explanations or non-terrestrial explanations have been explored in those books. Now, the book that I was lucky to receive, and Kevin, I'll explain this in a minute, I just almost finished, Encounter in the Desert, The Case for Alien Contact at Socorro. This is his new release, and I'm really excited about that. So, Kevin, welcome to Paranormal Now.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to add one thing, if I might.
Sure.
I wrote a book that came out last year called Roswell in the 21st Century, which was a dispassionate look at the Roswell case, tried to put it in a whole different perspective. So those of you who are interested in Roswell might want to take a look at that because it provides, I think, some new information about the Roswell case and kind of eliminates some of the nonsense that have grown up around that. And I think that's an important thing to do when we're looking at the Roswell case, because it has been so filled with all this other stuff that really is ancillary. There are too many people making up their parts of the story and things going off the rails. So I think this was an attempt to bring it all back to clear focus.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think there's a lot of good intention behind, particularly, let's say, Roswell, with all the new younger people coming up and doing research or people revisiting. But yes, the field could be splattered and spattered with not the best evidence, circumstantial, and I think that it has sort of fogged the field a bit, if I may. put it that way. So we appreciate
When
your
you,
efforts. Yeah.
when you begin talking about new people coming up and looking at the Roswell case, the problem is, I was fortunate. My partners in the research at one time or another, Don Schmidt, Tom Carey, Stan Friedman, um, Don Berliner, that's the name I was searching for, Don Berliner. We had an opportunity to talk to a lot of the people involved directly in this case.
Right.
Those people have since passed away.
Exactly. Yeah.
So the problem the new researcher has is they can't interview the people. They can't sit down and talk to them. They must rely upon the notes we took or the transcripts we made, the tapes that we made, to see what the people said and kind of follow it that way. So in that respect, we were fortunate because we had an opportunity to talk to an awful lot of the witnesses who were involved or people who claimed to be involved. We were later able to eliminate them from the witness pool, if you will.
Yeah, and I do think that it's quite possible that there are stories still out there yet told, especially passed down to, grandchildren. But I don't know how much is actually, reliable information at that point when it's just passed down generation after generation. But maybe. I'll leave it up to you, the researchers, to take care of that. And that's what I loved about this book. I've always wanted myself to go out and just, do research and investigation, but it takes a lot of time and energy and dedication and commitment to do this right. And this book, you go through example after example of similar cases to the Socorro reported crash landing, and it feels like I'm with you. It feels like I'm sort of in the field with you, and I enjoyed that so much.
I thought it was important to take a look again at the Socorro case, as I did with Roswell in the 21st century. Look at it from the perspective of 2017. Lonnie Zamora passed away several years ago, but I knew that he didn't want to talk to it. I have a friend, Bob Cornett, and he was in Socorro to look at the Very Large Array, which is the radio telescope out there near Magdalena, New Mexico. And while he was in Socorro, on a lark, he called Lonnie Zamora. And Zamora said, yeah, we're having a barbecue. Come on down, but we're not going to talk about the flying saucer. So Bob went down and had dinner with Lonnie Zamora, but they didn't talk about the UFO landing. So he was very reticent to talk about it, but there were other people who were involved at the time. There were lots of military records that were available that we were able to, or I was able to access and help bring things into focus about the Socorro case that weren't known before.
Right. Well, I know that the name is slipping me, but he was told by a couple of people. And I know we're sort of jumping the gun here, so we'll get back to the beginning of this story as we go. But Lonnie Zamora was told, his last name begins with an H, it's slipping me, to not report that he saw alien beings, right? Or symbols. So there was a lot of editing going on early on. Not all of it went well, but there was.
And that's exactly right. But the thing, you're talking about Richard Holder, of course, Captain Holder, who was an Army officer, who was involved almost from the beginning. I mean, within an hour and a half of the thing lifting off, Holder was involved along with an FBI agent named Arthur Burns. But Burns and Holder suggested to Lonnie that he not talk about the symbol, because they thought that if others reported the craft, they could eliminate those who were making up their sightings or trying to be copycats because they couldn't draw the proper symbol. And they thought that was a good idea. And Burns had suggested not to mention the aliens, the beings, because he thought that would open Lonnie Zamora up to a lot of criticism and ridicule, which turned out to be the case. So neither of these government officials, Army officer, FBI, were attempting to suppress information for nefarious purposes. They were attempting to withhold some of it, as you often do in a police investigation, so that you can eliminate those who are faking things. And they were suggesting to withhold the information about the alien beings simply because they thought that Lonnie Zamora's credibility would be attacked simply because he claimed to have seen alien beings. And as I said, that turned out to be the case, that there was a lot of things directed at Lonnie Zamora because he was talking about seeing alien creatures.
Hmm.
Although he never called them alien creatures, he called them things. He called them beings. He called them people, but he never talked about them being alien. And I think that was a derivative of his belief that this may have been some kind of a black project out of Alamogordo at Holloman Air Force Base or the White Sands Proving Grounds. And he was afraid he'd get into trouble with the government for talking about that. So I think that was part of his reticence as well. But all comes into play when you take a look at the case as it exists today, as opposed to the way it existed in 1964.
Right, and that was an investigative technique that was common for Project Blue Book, the Air Force, like you said, police work. So there was nothing strange about that. But it did sort of muddy the water later. And so I want to explain this now before we continue. I'd mentioned it earlier. So I had 20 pages of your book left to read, and it was my intent to finish that on the commute home today. Needless to say, my book is in New York, so I didn't get to finish the last 20 pages. So unless there's a spoiler alert, you can fill us in there. But yeah, I was kicking myself. Oh God! Before we went on the air.
And you would have missed all the good footnotes.
Oh yeah. Well, I saw the footnote. I flipped through some of them. Yes. But that's great. That's great that you did that work. Because then it's not just an opinion. It's not conjecture.
I think that and UFO literature is evolving, and you see more and more of the books with footnotes and indexes. Mm-hmm. And ancillary appendices providing additional information. And I wanted to make sure that the sources of the information were out there for people to track. I do a thing on my blog called Chasing Footnotes periodically, and what that involves, and the way it originated was I was looking for stories of disc-shaped objects prior to Kenneth Arnold's sighting in June of 1947, because skeptics will say, well, Kenneth Arnold didn't see a flying saucer. He saw an object that was more crescent shaped, and people heard the description flying saucer and they began reporting saucers as opposed to these crescent shaped objects. So I was looking for stories of these disc shaped objects prior to Arnold, and I had found one that Richard Hall put in his UFO evidence, and was trying to trace it back to its origin. And there was a note that it had been used by Frank Edwards in one of his lectures in 1956, talking about this railroad guy in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, railroad engineer who'd seen 9 objects in the sky, and the story was reported in the Cedar Rapids Gazette on June 24th, meaning that he could not have been responding to Arnold's sighting, because he was seeing the objects prior to Arnold, and it was reported prior to Arnold. And I thought, well, that's great. I want that story. So I began chasing it down, trying to chase it down, going through the footnotes, and finally found the original story came from the Cedar Rapids Gazette, and that's all it said. Cedar Rapids Gazette didn't tell me the date or anything else. And I went looking for it, and it turns out there was a guy. He was a railroad engineer. He did report seeing 9 objects in the sky that were disc-shaped. He did not live in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He lived in Peoria, Illinois, and the story didn't appear in the newspapers until June 27th, June 28th. So it was 3 or 4 days after Arnold. So it didn't do what I wanted it to do, but I was able to follow the footnotes back and get to the original story as it appeared in the newspapers and learn what I could about that and kind of clear up some of those misnomers. And that's the thing I wanted to do with this book is here's the original source of the information. It came from this guy. It came from this file at Project Blue Book. It came from this particular work, and let's see where it goes. So that if the reader wants to try to verify the information, he or she knows where to go to look for it. So that's the point of footnoting. And I think that a lot of the UFO writers today are beginning to do the same thing, or have been doing the same thing, actually providing good, solid footnotes of where the information came from. Sometimes it fails. I know Richard Dolan in his one of his books on the national security state had a footnote in there, and it linked back to Timothy Good's book, which linked back to something. It is a Lorenzen book that I was able to find in the April Bulletin, the Lorenzens being Jim and Carl Lorenzen, who published the April Bulletin, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization Bulletin. And I was able to find the original story, and the story had kind of, like the railroad engineer story, had kind of evolved over the telling. But by going back to the original source, I was able to learn the details of that case, which becomes very important and provides you with a possible explanation for the sighting rather than something that's just kind of left up in the air. And I didn't mean that punnily. I left up in the air. Get it? Flying saucers up in the air.
Yeah, because that's where they're left, up in the air. After we go chasing for them. Yeah.
My brain goes in strange directions.
Well, I mean, if you're in this field, I suspect it probably would. And the gentleman, the second witness to the Kenneth Arnold sighting, there was something about the way he spoke, and I don't know if you implied it in your writing or was just in the way his testimony spoke. His English sounded off, like very colloquial.
I think he was a poorly educated.
Mm-hmm.
He was obviously literate because he wrote a letter, but there were a lot of misspellings in the letter and
Mm-hmm.
things like that. I try to use that stuff because it gives you a feel for the individual. It could be a very bright guy, but he didn't have the educational background to express himself, or maybe just inarticulate, just unable to express himself well. But I think it's important for us not to embellish what the people said, to give you a real idea of who they are. When I was serving in Iraq, I was doing a lot of the newspaper articles for the Public Affairs Office, and the battalion commander asked me one day why I had to put the ages of people in the stories, because he was pushing 40 and he didn't want that known apparently. But and I said to him, because it gives you an idea of the reliability of the source. If I tell a story and I say the person was 14 years old, that tells you something about the person. If I say that person is 54 years old, that tells you something else about the person. Doesn't mean the 14-year-old is unreliable, but it tells you a little bit about that individual. I think it's important for you to grasp the story. And if he's 54, it tells you something about him that helps you to grasp the story. And if you put their words in as they spoke them, it tells you a little bit about them as well. And you're not trying to embellish their account. You're not trying to clean it up for whatever reason. You're reporting accurately what this person said. And I think that's important as well, because it all gives you information that leads to the reliability of that particular source, or the believability of that particular source, depending on how you want to take it.
All right, and so, Kevin, where can people find your works, and which site do you prefer that they go to visit to find out more about you?
If they go to www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com, they'll see a lot of stuff on there. I've been doing the blog for like 10 years. There's nearly 900 articles on it, and most of them deal with UFOs. I get off into the esoteric, like the Curse of Oak Island periodically.
I'm looking at that one right now. Yep.
and things like that. But the books are all available at Amazon. A lot of them are available in your bookstores, and or the other e-readers have them available. So they're out there to be found. And I always say, if you get the book and you like it, put a review up on Amazon, because that'll earn me an extra 10 or 15 cents, and I can use that to fund a coffee or a cup of coffee or something.
Yeah, it's helpful also for the credibility, because I think that you have certainly earned it. I'll bring this up real quick. The Curse of Oak Island. It's funny. I did an interview with Xavier Hayes for our last episode, and we kind of discussed this briefly because we had technical issues, so we had to reschedule. And then I realized we rescheduled during the play of Curse of Oak Island. And my stomach sank. No, I can't miss it. And I joke because I say it's one of the best shows on TV for me, and yet it's the show about nothing.
Oh yeah, I was going to say they never do anything. The last episode, I fell asleep and it was so boring.
Yeah.
Oh my God, we found a piece of metal. Well, yippee!
Yeah,
it's not like they haven't dug up the whole damn island.
Right. It really falls into that category of just watching guys do stuff that you can't do because that's not what you do. Um,
But I'm thinking they're about to sink the island. They drilled so many holes
oh
in it
God, yeah.
since
Mhm.
what 1795, and everybody's drilling holes in different places, and they're tunneling here and they're tunneling there, and I'm thinking the island's about to collapse. I just, you know,
Yeah, because
so
when you see those aerial shots, it really you realize that is not there's not much space there.
and then the other thing is, and they get so excited when we found this spike that looks like it came from a ship. Yeah, wow, great, wonderful.
Right.
I think last week they were talking about, well, we found evidence that the island has been inhabited for hundreds of years. Yeah, we know that. That's not a secret. Last year, I think they found evidence of a British camp, and there's a woman named Joy Steele who
Mhm.
did a book, Oak Island Mystery Solved. And she's come up with what I think is a very plausible explanation. And there's really not money buried there, but what the boys found back in 1795. And there's links to that on my blog as well, so you can get there and you can see her book. And I did a show about it as well with her, talking about Oak Island. So I think she's got a very plausible explanation, and it explains the debris that they keep finding there. So
Like the wood encased in concrete or something like that.
yeah, it explains everything, and I mean, if you watch the teasers for season 5, they said here's this pirate's chest. They've got a pirate's chest, and you go, wow, great. In the second episode, they say, yeah, it belongs to this guy named James Anderson, and his relative descendant lives here in Halifax, and we'll go visit with him. And they pull the chest out, and of course, there's no gold in it or anything. It's just a lot of interesting memorabilia, especially if you happen to be a member of the family. But it really doesn't take us to the solution for the mystery of Oak Island. So
No, they really teased it heavy this year. I think they knew they needed to keep people tuning in. They really made it sound like they had a big find this year. I hope that they do. That did. Even if it's not what they think it is, I hope that's something exciting. Because there's treasures all over the place. So Oak Island just be maybe one place of many others along the eastern border, and who knows what they'll find. But I guess it's the journey, not the destination in this case.
yeah, I'm afraid that's it. I don't think they're going to find anything. I think if there was ever any treasure there, it's long gone. And I think, and there was something that I'd read just the other day. The reason for the artificial swamp, I saw something, a paper that suggested that some of the natives that inhabited the area had created this artificial swamp for the oyster beds, or created oyster beds in the area for a food supply, and that's why they have this artificial swamp. The Smith's Cove is an artificial beach, and they were creating that for the oysters. And I thought that was kind of interesting, and I think I did a posting on my blog about that where I made a pun about at Smith's Cove they were holding the ocean at bay, and I said yes, I said that on purpose.
Right. And the coconut fibers, that's tantalizing. No.
Yeah, and they also talked about throwing the dye. I remember reading about Oak Island long ago, for me anyway, where they had thrown dye into what was originally the money pit, and it bubbled up in other places out in the ocean around the island. And the Leganis brothers tried that at Oak Island in their latest assault on it, and the dye never reappeared. They couldn't find where it went. So it's one of those things. And Borehole 10X, which we heard about for decades, literally decades, where there was a possibility of a body down there and a chest and tools, and they finally send a diver down there, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I wouldn't do that on for all the money that you could throw at me. It just seems like an incredibly dangerous thing to have done. But he goes down Borehole 10X, he gets to the bottom, and there's no body, there's no chest, there's no tools, there's nothing down there. It was artifacts of the poor quality of the video camera they used, which in the time that they used it was probably the best quality they could get. The technologists hadn't evolved where we're doing high definition, where you can see all the flaws in the actors' faces on television now. But so that, it kept things alive for a long time. But I think they've just pretty much run out of steam. They've taken as far as they can go, and I don't know. I don't know where they're going to go. They're not going to find a treasure. So
yeah, I guess they're going to go as long as the show has ratings, because otherwise I don't think they're going to spend any more money of their own. That's for sure on the search.
Well, I don't think the Leganis are spending their own money. I don't think they've been spending their own money for a long time. I think
for a long time, right? But initially,
History Channel has been financing it, and they're probably getting well paid for their parts in the story. And I know Nova Scotia put $1.5 million into the project because it's bringing tourists into the area.
Oh yeah, they're making a killing.
Yeah, and so it's a wise investment. You'll come to Oak Island, and I'm thinking, yeah, on a dare, sure, I'll be there. So
I mean, I might go to go camping, just to get away for a while. But
I lost my taste for camping when I was in the Army. And we were forced to go camping.
Yeah.
Different perspective.
I was gonna say that's a different kind of camping too, though.
Yes.
So we're getting close to the end of the first quarter here. So we covered a lot of ground, but we didn't really start from the beginning. So if you can let us know what this story is.
Moving back to UFOs and the Lonnie Zamora case from Socorro, New Mexico, on April 24th, 1964, and I give you the dates just so that you get an idea of how old the case is.
Sure.
Zamora was chasing a speeder through Socorro when he heard an explosion on the outskirts of town. He thought a dynamite shed that was out there had exploded, and he broke off the chase and went to see what was the damage had been done. Came up over a rise, and he saw down in the arroyo below him what he thought at first was an overturned car, and he tried to get his patrol car down there, drove up and down a little bit. Finally left his patrol car and walked down and got fairly close to the object on the ground and realized that it wasn't a car. Saw two beings outside the craft, outside the object, whatever it might have been, who looked toward him and seemed startled to see him there. They ran around behind, and there was a clang like a hatch closing, and the thing in a roar lifted off and disappeared in a matter of a few seconds. He called one of his superiors, Sergeant Sam Chavez of the New Mexico State Police. They were friends, and he wanted Chavez to come out, and Chavez would later say that Zamora looked as if he had seen a ghost. I mean, he was just, the color drained from his face, and he was quite upset about this, thinking that he'd maybe seen a black project, something the government was doing and didn't want to talk about. And I think Chavez pretty well had that idea as well. But Chavez is there in like 2.5 minutes, so the object is long gone. From that point on, there were people in the area on the scene continuously that night. Eventually, and I say eventually, an hour and a half later, Richard Holder, who was the uprange commander at the White Sands Missile Range, his duty station at White Sands was closer to Socorro than the actual base of White Sands, which is down near Alamogordo was. So he lived in Socorro. He was either called by his lieutenant or he was called by the FBI agent who was there, Arthur Burns. But both of them showed up at the Socorro police station by 7:20 in the evening. Zamora made the sighting around 6 o'clock. And I say around 6 o'clock, it was like 5:55 or something like that. So they're there right after the thing, and they pretty much interrogate Zamora about what he had seen. Suggested to him that they not talk about the symbol he saw, and he drew the symbol quickly after the thing disappeared, so he wouldn't forget what it looked like on a scrap of paper, and then later he drew it for Holder. Signed his name to both.
Yeah,
yes,
did he do that on the scene? Did he take it out of his vehicle?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
He was sitting in his vehicle, and he had a scrap of paper, and he drew it right there before Chavez showed up. So it was literally within a minute or two of the object disappearing. And then he drew it later for Holder and signed his name to it. Signed his name to both of those, so we have that.
Okay, well, let's hold it right there. We'll pick up the rest of the story when we come back after this first break. I'm speaking with author Kevin Randle, Encounter in the Desert, the case for alien contact at Socorro. This is Alan B. Smith for Inception Radio Network on Paranormal Now, or first at Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network, and we will be right back. All right, so Kevin, we left off where Lonnie Zamora, during the, was it April 26, 1964?
April 24th.
24th?
April 24th.
1964, 24th. Yep. He saw this crash, a seemingly crash, perhaps a landing.
No, landing, a landing. It's a landing.
Okay.
Yeah, landing.
So there's no room to believe it was a crash landing of sorts, meaning wasn't something problematic. It was a controlled landing.
It was a controlled landing, but it could be what we in the military used to call a forced landing, which means something went wrong and you had to land the airplane or the aircraft.
Okay. That makes more sense, right?
Which is not to say that you couldn't then fly it off, and obviously they did. But where we left off, we had Arthur Burns and Richard Holder talking to Zamora in the police station that very night within 90 minutes of him seeing the object, talking to him about what he's seen, getting the idea of what he'd seen, suggesting he not talk about the symbol, suggesting he not talk about the beings that he saw, not that they were attempting to suppress the information. I always want to make that clear because with the Project Blue Book eventually get involved in all that. There's an idea that there was suppression of information. I didn't really see any of that. Here they were thinking more of Lonnie Zamora and a way of validating other sightings. But Holder wrote a report that very night and sent it off. It's only about a half-page single space. Now, when I was doing my radio show, I had two guys on, Ben Moss and Tony Angiola. And they said that Zamora wasn't the only one that saw the object, because I'd always complained that the problem with the sighting is a single witness. We don't have another witness. And they said, no, 3 people saw the object in the sky before Zamora saw it landed. And it had called the police station about it. I said, yeah, but did you check the police logs? Did you get the police records? They said no. Or they didn't say no. They never really answered the question to my satisfaction, which inspired me to take a look for more information. And in doing that, I came across in the Project Blue Book files Holder's report that was written that very night. And he mentions that 3 people saw a blue flame or an object in the sky prior to Zamora seeing it landed. So now we have documented evidence that there were other people who saw the thing and called the police station. The problem is the police dispatcher didn't take their names. He just kind of blew the whole thing off. What annoys me now, sitting here, is Jim and Cora Lorenzen went to Socorro within 48 hours. They're talking to Zamora. You have Sergeant Moody, who was a Project Blue Book investigator in 1964. He's there within a couple of days. He's there with Alan Hynek, who was the consultant. Ray Stanford, who was the NICAP guy, he was there within a couple of days of the sighting. All of them talked to all of these people, and Zamora and Chavez and all of that. Nobody tried to find out who those people were that called the police station. Socorro wasn't that big. The flight path was pretty well known. It wouldn't have been all that hard to go out into the neighborhood and knock on some doors and see what others might have seen. But the important point is Holder mentions the phone calls to in his report to the Pentagon. I think it went to one of the command posts in the Pentagon, and that documents that there were other witnesses to the sighting. Later on that evening, there's a couple of other people who saw an object away from Socorro, but it was still in New Mexico. And we have some of those names. There was a person who called a TV station in Albuquerque, and Socorro's not that far south of Albuquerque, talking about this, but they didn't bother to write down the name because nobody knew what was going on, and blew that off. And then the next day, I think it was in La Madera, New Mexico, there was another landing, and the object seems to be pretty much the same as the one that Zamora saw. And when it took off, it left the burned area like it did in Socorro. And that was another point I'll get to in a moment. But it took off, left the burned area. The guy who reported to the sheriff before he and the sheriff had learned about the Socorro sighting. So it's an interesting bit of corroboration there. At the landing site in Socorro, there were 4 landing pad marks, and they clearly weren't excavations. They were pressed into the soil. And when the thing left off, it burned part of a bush and some scrub grass around that site. But interesting, Chavez said that when he went down and felt the bush, it wasn't warm. It was still smoking, but it wasn't warm. And chemical analysis showed no sort of a petrochemical reaction there or any kind of accelerant that might have been used to burn the bush. So that was kind of a conundrum for them. So you have the physical evidence of the landing imprints, and Harder and Burns and everybody else saw them. There's pictures of them. There's pictures of them in the book that I got from the Air Force, as a matter of fact, from the Air Force files. So it's, there was physical evidence left behind. It wasn't, well, I just saw this thing and it took off. There was nothing left behind. There was actually things left behind. The analysis of the soil samples and all that didn't reveal any radiation, didn't reveal any accelerants, didn't reveal any petrochemicals that would cause the burns, anything that would cause the burns. So, there's kind of a mystery there as well. Up in La Madera, there was a melded pop bottle associated with this thing. And I mentioned that only because it's important in another aspect. There were two guys from Dubuque, Iowa. And this landing took place on a Friday evening. In the Wednesday morning newspaper, so it's less than a week after the landing, there's a story about these two guys who had seen the object in Socorro. And they described what they'd seen. It doesn't really match the descriptions that Zamora gave, which is a pretty telltale sign there. But they mentioned the melted pop bottle. And I'm thinking what happened. Their story was they were driving through Socorro at the time the object took off, and they saw it in the air, and they knew the roads, but their description doesn't fit with what Zamora said, and they described the melted pop bottle, and that's the wrong sighting. And I think that kind of negates their testimony. And I think it's important to look at that. You say, well, there's all these people that, said they were there. These two guys probably weren't. They made up the story. I searched for them as I was doing the book. I know some others have searched for them and haven't found them. A fellow here in Iowa named Ralph DeGraw talked to him about 10 years after the sighting. And the information from his investigation is in the MUFON Journal, and I don't remember the date off the top of my head, but cleverly it's footnoted in the book so that you can look that up as well and see what DeGraw learned from these guys. And he was pretty well convinced that they probably weren't involved either. But there are people who were involved. There was a tourist, and they said they were driving a green Cadillac, and they stopped at a gas station and had a discussion with a fellow named Oprah Grinder, who was the manager of the gas station, and talking about how your aircraft fly pretty low around here. And then they got in their car, took off. Now, they looked for those people, and there was no credit card receipt. In today's environment, everybody would have been paying with a credit card.
And security cameras.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, there have been all ways of tracing these, but 1964, not so much. It was a green Cadillac, and they thought it was from Colorado. And I'd always laughingly said, I grew up in Colorado, so I was living in Colorado in 1964. And I said, but I didn't have a Cadillac. And I thought about, yeah, I did have a Cadillac when I was in high school. It was like, 20 years old, but it was a Cadillac. So it could have been me, but it wasn't. And my car was blue and not green. But the point is, those people never came forward. The people who called the police never came forward. And I found that pretty strange, especially after it started getting some publicity. And I'm wondering if the tone of some of the newspaper articles didn't convince the people not to say anything about it. It's astonishing that somebody didn't come forward and talk about what they had seen back in April of 1964. I just don't understand that. But clearly they haven't. I was talking to Ray Stanford, and he said that while he was in Socorro with the radio announcer who had interviewed a number of people, this was not long after the event, and the two older women came up to him and was talking about having heard the roar. And I said to Ray, do you have their names? And he said, well, their old ladies are probably dead by now. And I'm thinking, yeah, but if we had the names, we might be able to find out where they lived, and there might be somebody around who was around in 1964 that we could talk to.
They
a long
story
shot.
too.
A long shot at best. I mean, you're a teenager in 1964, as was I.
Do you know why Ray Stanford, why he did not have the names available? Did he never take them down?
Well, he had them. He apparently had them, but if his files are anything like mine, the accumulation of 50 or 60 years of UFO research, and we're not librarians, so it's not well cataloged. From what I understand, his is even worse cataloged than mine. And he had written the names down, but he just didn't know where to find them. And So, that was kind of a lead that went nowhere. But I'm thinking, if we had the names and we could get a hold of a phone book from 1964, which is not that hard of a task, with libraries and everything, and for the millennials out there, a phone book is this document you used to get once a year, and it had everybody's telephone number, and you just look it up, but it was only for your local town. Unlike type somebody's name into the internet, and you can get 900 people with the same name. But you could find out where they lived, the section of Socorro they lived in, and see if you couldn't maybe find somebody who had been there since 1964 that could tell you something about that. But that was just it's just one of those things that we're now more than 50 years down the road, and it's a really difficult task to go back that far and find people who might have some kind of knowledge that hadn't talked about it since, simply because of all the publicity. You would think that they would have said something by now if they had any information to share. So,
right. Well, I mean, back then the closest thing you had to the internet would be the operator who kind of served as your search engine. You could call and say, hey, I'm trying to get in touch with so and so in a town, and they would actually try to find that person for you if possible.
I actually got Bill Brazel's telephone number. Bill Brazel from the Roswell case. And I called up, and I had the wrong town. And the operator said, oh, there's a Bill Brazel living over in... And I said, well, that's got to be the guy. And I called him, and it was. She's helping me. I don't even have the right town, and she manages to find the guy for me. This was in the late 80s. And I sent a letter to a building in New York. A skyscraper, of course, but a building in New York, and I'd had the wrong floor, and they sent it back because they couldn't find out. They couldn't find the person. I'm thinking, you got it narrowed down to a building. You can't find it. The operator, I've got it narrowed down to New Mexico, and finds the guy for me. Yep. And I talked to Bill. He was again reticent to talk, but when Don Schmidt and I went to meet with him, we kind of chatted for a while, and he finally opened up to us, and he told us that he told his wife Shirley that if he liked us, he'd help us out, and if he didn't, he'd just end the conversation. So he liked us, and so we're back there again. And I know I'm off onto a Roswell again, but because this is kind of funny. So we meet him at 8 o'clock in the morning to go out to the debris field where he'd found some bits of the pieces of the debris. And we're driving down the road, and he says, you boys want a beer? I'm thinking it's 8 o'clock in the morning. And Don says, no, thank you. And I'm thinking, somebody ought to drink a beer with this guy. So I said, yeah, I'll have a beer. So I'm drinking warm beer, driving through New Mexico at 8 o'clock in the morning. So, but we got out to the place and looked around, and Bill was a great guy. Helped us out as much as he could. So,
yeah, I mean that's a fascinating story, and it reminded me. My father was actually adopted, and he found out that he was adopted when he was 12 or 13. He had gotten hold of some original birth certificate document. In the attic or somewhere in his house, and he never told his mother that he knew until she passed, and she was 80 something when she passed.
Well, his birth mother or his adoptive mother?
He never told his birth mother. He never told his adopted mother that he realized he knew he was adopted. So they never told him into his adulthood that he was adopted, and he never brought it up. And so it wasn't until after my grandmother passed away that he told my grandfather, look, I've known for, at that point, it must have been 30 years. And so he told my grandfather, look, I want to look for my biological parents. So he did. And this was in the mid to late 90s this started. So the internet was not quite robust. So he had to do a lot of cold calling and requesting documents, snail mail. But eventually he tracked him down. It was just a matter of making those last phone calls and someone saying, nope, not this person. You got to call this person. And he did. He found his family.
Well, moving this back to Socorro.
Thank you.
Because what you were telling me fits into this. So I am talking to Ben Moss and Tony Angiola, and they're talking about the symbol they saw, and there's some discrepancy about the symbol that Zamora saw, and there's some discrepancy about it. And he said, we have to understand, we have the real symbol from the real files of this, and I'm talking to them about this, and they said, a fellow named Rob Mercer has them. He's a UFO researcher from Ohio. So I called Rob Mercer, and I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, he periodically would look at Craigslist to see if there was UFO material on there, because sometimes it pops up, and he found somebody offering a box of Project Blue Book documents. So he paid the guy $100 and got the documents. And one of the things in this box was a huge file on the Socorro case, which doesn't exactly match the official file. And he said, Mercer said, so he talked to the guy who bought the box, and the guy said, well, he had bought a load of lumber at a garage sale, and this box had been hidden behind the lumber, and he took the box with the lumber. And when he looked at it, he knew that nobody wanted it. So Mercer finds out who owned the house, or where the guy bought the box, who owns the house, talked to him, found the owner of it beforehand, tracked the guys down. Turned out the guy's name was Carmen Morano. Tracked the guy down. Carmen Morano technically was the last chief of Project Blue Book. I think he took over when Hector Quintanilla left. But the thing is, through the detective work, by checking tax records and all of this, he found out who the owner of the house was, managed to track down the guy who had saved the box, and got the whole story of the box because of the tenacity. He had a little bit easier than your father did because he's working with the internet and that sort of thing in today's environment. But I'm thinking, what an incredible piece of detective work to be able to get to the box and then find the guy. And he talked to him about it. I said, what's the deal with these records? And he said, well, as Blue Book was being closed down in 1969, there were all these files that were not part of the official files. He said they were created by others who had been at Project Blue Book, and as a way of providing information to people who came to look at Project Blue Book.
Right. Like reference notes.
Yeah, well, but what he had was like 200 pages for the Socorro case.
Yeah, that's crazy.
And so I was able to match it with the official record as well. So I know what the discrepancies were. But I mean, so he had found all this information that had been collected into a non-classified file. Actually, there's not much in the Project Blue Book files that was ever classified. But so Morano had said that there was all this information that was collected for easy access for reporters. They'd ask about specific cases. I mean, you can imagine if you're a reporter in late 1960s going to Project Blue Book, you're going to want to know about the Socorro case. So they had collected all this stuff out of the official files and put it in to a loose leaf binder so that they could flip through it. Did the same thing with photographs and other cases that were well known. Levelland Sparks, the Levelland case would be another one that people would have asked about and had been kept in separate folders for the ease of accessing information. So we had a lot of that kind of information. But the Socorro case was one of those documents, and some of the pictures in the book are actually from that file that Morano found, and Mercer found, and I had a nice conversation with Morano about what was going on in Blue Book at the end of Project Blue Book and how they conducted the operation and the investigations toward the end of Project Blue Book. And I think that technically Morano ended up as would have been the last senior officer at Project Blue Book, so he technically would have been the head of it as they closed the thing down, but it had no more investigative responsibilities or anything like that. It was mainly he was there to close out the documentation.
Now imagine, had this documentation been top secret, where would it be? Would you have ever been able to find it?
If it had been classified top secret, they would have done two things with it. Top secret requires a vault. If you've got secret material, you can keep it in a safe. If you've got top secret material, it's got to be kept in a vault. So, it's really different. I have found, going through the documentations, I have not found anything labeled top secret. I have found stuff labeled secret, and that's a whole different kettle of fish. And then stuff labeled confidential, which is an even lower classification. And then for official use only, which even just means use it for official use. You don't spread it around if you don't have to, but there's really no caveat against talking about it. But most of the stuff in Project Blue Book, at least toward the end, was unclassified. There was no classifications on it, and a lot of stuff that Morano had, the stuff that Morano had wasn't classified. So it was just derivatives of the irregular files. But if it had been top secret, most top secret requires a review before it's downgraded. Secret material can be downgraded. They say downgraded at 3-year intervals, which means after 3 years it becomes confidential, and 3 years after that it becomes basically unclassified. Mm-hmm. Top secret, for the most part, remains classified until somebody physically looks at it and downgrades it, and it really incumbent upon the agency that created the document to downgrade it. There is stuff from World War I that is still classified top secret. I don't know why, but nobody's bothered to review it. Nobody's bothered to downgrade it. It's just one of those things. The other thing that happens a lot of times with classified materials is they're destroyed. And I know as an intelligence officer, I destroyed a lot of classified material. What you do is, if it was confidential, you just burned it. If it was secret or top secret, you had to provide the names of the documents, you had to the date of the documents, and other identifying features of the document, and then you needed 2 people to certify that the document had been destroyed, properly destroyed. And what we would do would destroy documents that were out of date. And the thing that springs to mind is there was 2 versions of the CIA fact book, for example, which one was an unclassified version. And think of the CIA fact book was basically just a encyclopedia type entry of information about countries, give you who the leaders were and that sort of thing. But there was also a classified version that was replaced every 6 months. So you'd have to destroy the old one and replace it with the new one. And, it was just updated material. And I never found anything in the classified version that was particularly exciting or needed to be classified. But I'm sure if you looked far enough, you'd find classified material in there that didn't match the unclassified version. But the point really is, if there was top secret material, it would have had to have been reviewed, and they would have decided whether or not a release of the material would have affected national security. If it was obsolete material, they may have just destroyed it. And I would think that would probably be what happened with Blue Book. Although they kept all the files. They sent them to Maxwell Air Force Base, to the Air Force Archives, and then Jack Webb was doing this program called Project UFO, which was a dragnet type program I was searching for, investigating UFOs based on the Air Force files, and I could never figure out what case he was basing it on. But the point of Jack Webb in this story is that he paid to have the films, the whole Project Blue Book files microfilmed, so he could get a copy of them. And that helped all of us because then there's microfilms available of it. Now, of course, it's all online. Yeah, that's the other thing. It's all online. Once I used to say, I have a complete set of the Project Blue Book files. And we go, oh, my God, he's got a complete set. In today's environment, yeah, so do I. It's on fold 3, you dummy. All that information is out there. But I've noticed there are things that are left out of the fold 3 stuff that were on the microfilms, and there's some things that were not on the microfilms that like the Socorro case. I found some things in there, but mainly unimportant stuff. But there were some differences.
The Socorro case, simultaneous with the landing, you had mentioned La Madera. La Madera is about 195 miles away. Do you know what the time difference was between those 2 sightings, approximately?
Without looking at my book as a reference,
was it a few hours, 6 hours?
I'm thinking it's more like 24, maybe 48. I think it probably 24 because neither the witness and the witness's name is in the book, and
Oliver something, right?
It's always a secondary case. Socorro's the big one, and then they say, oh yeah, by the way, La Madera, which I think was important to discuss that case to get a feel for it. But since the witness didn't know about the Socorro case, and the sheriff didn't know about it.
Right.
Suggests to me, and of course the timing is in the book, so I probably should have a copy of it sitting here so I could look it up. But
But it was
I
a
think
short
it was
enough
like
period where they
it was
wouldn't
in
have heard the news.
they hadn't heard the news, and
Mm-hmm.
since it was news around the country not long after the sighting, that it would have to be a very short period. But I'm thinking it was 24 hours. I think it was 24 hours. Air Force wrote the La Madera case off as being a fire in a dump.
Right, which is absurd. I mean, the witness, he mentions blue flame, and then later he said there was like a red or an orange flare to it, or at the tips of the flame,
Yeah,
which is similar
which
to Socorro.
yes, exactly. And it's because it is important because it's close in time, it's close in location, and it has many of the elements that Zamora discussed in it as well. But it always takes, you read a lot of books that mention the Socorro case in it, and they devote a few pages to it, but they rarely mention La Madera. And it's an important case because, again, we have another witness and we have something going on that seems to corroborate what Lonnie Zamora said. So when we say, Lonnie Zamora's case is single witness, it turns out, well, yeah, not really. There are other witnesses, and we know there are other sightings in New Mexico around that time frame that are important, and there are similar cases. And I discuss some of them in the book. I had said for a long time that there's only one case in the Project Blue Book files in which there were occupants seen, and the case is labeled unidentified, and that's, of course, the Socorro case. But it turns out there's actually two other cases, neither of them nearly as robust as the Socorro case. And one of them actually takes place behind the Iron Curtain, and the guy and his daughter eventually escaped into West Germany and told the story after they escaped into West Germany. And it's in the Blue Book files, but for the longest time I said, well, no, it's not. And I was looking for the case, and I discovered that the date, as it's given in some other publications, wasn't quite right. Once I found the correct date, I was able to find the case, but it's not in a case file.
Well,
it's
I
like
think you said
paper.
I think you said something like Alan Hynek came across it via the CIA or some other means.
Yeah, exactly.
But hold it right there. We're coming up to the second break. Speaking with Kevin Randle, and we're talking UFOs and mysteries in the New Mexico desert. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
You didn't forget what's coming up tonight, did you? Hi, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Never miss that interview you were looking forward to or the show on your favorite topic. Follow IRN on Twitter, I_R_N, and get reminders about the evening's live shows as well as fun and important updates throughout the week. That's I_R_N, and never miss a great show again.
And hang with us, because I assure you, it is worth the listen. And taking us out of the break was One Love by Bob Marley. All right, so let's bring it back again to the Socorro case. We have a penchant tonight for kind of skewing off in one direction or another, but it all connects. So we had essentially, as far as the core aspect of the story goes, really where we left it off is that Sam Chavez came. And later we did mention that he had conversations about what to say and not to say. But if we can just pick it up from Sam Chavez meets Lonnie Zamora at the site, and then what happens?
Well, the first thing he does, he parks his car beside Zamora's car, and he looks inside to see if there's a shovel or anything in there, which strikes me as kind of odd. But Chavez said that's what he did to see if there was anything like that. And then he walks down to the area where Lonnie Zamora is, which is the landing site. And he sees the impressions in the ground, and he sees the smoking bush, and he makes his observations there, and he talks to Lonnie about what is seen. And eventually others show up because they've heard the calls go out over the police radio, Lonnie Zamora calling back into the sheriff's department or the police station, and others see it. So other people show up. So there are other people on the site within minutes, literally within minutes of the thing taking off. So they see it in its pristine state. And that includes eventually Holder and Burns. Holder calls back to his either the first sergeant or one of his lieutenants, and orders some MPs out there to cordon off the area. So they kind of protect the area. They find the landing traces. They stack rocks around that so they would remain intact. The pictures are taken of the scene. One of the fellows, and the name escapes me, it's in the book, took photographs, and the story is that when the film was developed, it was fogged as if it had been exposed to radiation, which is interesting. They did check for radiation with Geiger counters and didn't find any. It was just normal background radiation type stuff. Mm-hmm. So they kind of cordon off the area. They protect the scene. They take Lonnie back to the police station. They talk to him. They talk to Chavez. And as I said, Holder writes a short report that is communicated to the Pentagon. And it seems that it was not quite clear in the documentation whether he called first or they called him to talk to him about what was going on. But anyhow, he was in communication with people at the Pentagon on a secure line, one that you can talk about classified material over. And the line went dead, and they had to reconnect in some fashion. But Holder's report was written that night, which is important because now we have the investigator producing a report within hours of the landing. The newspapers get a hold of it. They talk about it. The newspaper in Socorro, I think, was published twice a week at the time, and the next issue was coming out on Tuesday. They didn't get the story, didn't publish the story until Tuesday, but of course they had a lot of time to check it, but other people knew about it. I remember seeing Walter Cronkite talk about the case back in 1964, so it was national news about that. And then you had the investigators coming in, their samples being taken by various individuals. Ray Stanford took a bunch. And what's kind of interesting is while he was out on the scene, the landing site with Hynek and Zamora and Chavez, Hynek didn't have anything to collect samples in, and he borrowed some things from Stanford to collect samples. But Holder had taken samples the night of the landing. And I was trying to what happened to those, and if you read the Project Blue Book files, you find out that Holder turned all that material over to Hynek, and then later on you find in the Project Blue Book files the analysis, and they found nothing spectacular. They didn't find any, as I said, didn't find any evidence of any chemical, petrochemicals or accelerants that would cause the burning or anything like that. There was nothing extraordinary about the soil. Right. It was just normal New Mexico soil. But samples were taken, samples were analyzed, photographs were taken. There's good photographs of what the landing pads looked like, and that sort of thing. Philip Klass, the great debunker, and I remember seeing
the dark figure, Philip Klass.
Darth Klass. He, in one of his books, he had a picture of a scrubbing pad with knitting needles stuck in it in the relationship of the landing gear. And he said, well, the landing gear is asymmetrical, and this makes no sense. And I'm thinking, you don't know what symmetry is for an alien creature. They might have been really, really happy with the way it looked. And the second thing you didn't do was correct for the terrain, because it wasn't a flat surface. There was terrain features, and so you could say the landing gear compensated for the terrain. So even though the angles looked odd when it's based on a flat surface, if you compensated for it, then it would be symmetrical. And it looks like the landing gear were pretty much symmetrical, and the burn area was right in the middle of it. I cannot understand you using a chemical rocket to travel interstellar distances. But that's just me, and I don't understand. There was nothing to suggest this chemical rocket that caused it to lift off with the roar left any kind of residue behind, which is kind of odd as well. So there were those kind of problems.
Well, that's another one of those issues, and it's just fresh in my mind because I interviewed Xavier Hayes last week about ancient aliens in the Bible. And it was that same problem. Is why would there be descriptions of people using rockets, and why is that a fair argument? I'm not ruling it out, but it just seems highly unlikely that another civilization came here to Earth using rocketry.
We use it to get off planet, but I think if we found a better propulsion system, we'd be using that.
Right. Like I said, I'm not going to rule it out, but it just seems unlikely, very unlikely.
And that's just it. But we don't know. And that's like, it's kind of the question about the symmetry of the landing gear, and making the point, well, the landing gear wasn't symmetrical, ergo it was faked because he didn't measure things properly when he dug the landing gear impressions. But of course, soil compression and everything else suggested these were pressed into the soil as opposed to something that was excavated. But I think, we don't know what how an alien race would think, and maybe symmetry isn't that important to them. You would think that you'd want the four legs underneath the craft to support the weight equally, but there might be some reason that they don't do that we don't know about. I just saw something on the Taj Mahal moving into a different direction, but the point is, when you look at the big dome at the Taj Mahal, you think it's symmetrical, and it turns out it's not. It's off by like 3 feet. One side bulges and the out further than the other side does. You can't see it when you look at it, but if you measure it, you find out that it's not completely symmetrical. So, looking at it from that point of view and saying, well, the landing gear wasn't symmetrical really doesn't mean much. There's other factors that need to be taken into consideration. Sure.
In math and physics is ever evolving, particularly in space travel. And I always found it kind of odd. I don't know the name of the very small division that NASA has where they are researching anti-gravity propulsion. It seems a bit odd, right? That they would even have such a department that is apparently speculative. If it's so speculative, why have anyone looking into it?
Well, I think theoretically it exists, but can we create something that uses an anti-gravity field? I mean, well, I guess a similar thing would be anti-magnetic. You get the two poles together and they'll repel each other. And so maybe gravity works in a similar fashion, and you can use that to move off planets to your bigger ships. It doesn't seem possible that the craft that Zamora saw would have been an interstellar craft. But then again, we don't know, because we don't know the dynamics of interstellar flight. It may be, once you know the secrets, it's very, very simple and not time consuming. Where we stand in the world today, we don't know that. If we just got our probe Voyager outside the limits of the solar system. I think they now claim the solar system is out about a light year from the sun. The sun, gravitational influence goes out about a light year. And Voyager just moved beyond that point, and it's been traveling since the mid-1970s. And it didn't have to traverse the whole light year. It only had to move outside the gravitational influence of the sun. And I think they talk about it being able to reach the nearest star in 86,000 years. That's a long trip. If there is no way to short circuit the distances, I don't see us making much in the way of interstellar flight. If there are ways to short circuit that we don't understand, and it may have to do with gravity, it may have to do with wormholes, it may have to do with being able to develop faster than light drive, then those arguments kind of fly out the window. The thing I think of is it's easier to fly from New York to Los Angeles than it is from, say, Des Moines, Iowa to Los Angeles or to New York, because you end up having to go bizarre directions. I took a trip from Cedar Rapids, Iowa to Los Angeles, and to get there, I had to fly to Cincinnati. And that's like, 90 minutes in the wrong direction. And you get on a plane in Cincinnati, then you start flying back west. And so after 3 hours on the airplane, I'm back to where I started. Now we can go on to LA. But if I'm in New York, I get to get to LA a lot faster because there's all these direct flights. There may be some kind of mechanism that the farther the distance, the easier it is to get there. There may be ways of short-circuiting the distances that we don't understand. I don't know. And that would suggest, well, I was just going to say, that would suggest a difference in the kind of craft. You wouldn't have the big aircraft carrier type things flying around. You could get there like in your personal car type thing. I mean, something smaller than these huge ships.
Right. And I'm wondering, the blue flames that are reported in multiple cases that you reference to in this book, what are those blue flames? Are they misinterpreted lights, or are people actually seeing flames?
No, they're flames. They're flames. They're flames. They're flames. And some of them are tinged with orange and some of them are not. But no, it's actual flames. And I think in Holder's report, if I remember correctly, he doesn't really give numbers. He talks about the 3 people who called the police, but he says they reported flames in the sky or they reported an object. But he doesn't say, 2 people reported flames, 1 person reported an object or anything like that. He just reports, they saw flames in the object. Mm-hmm. So, which would be a nice thing to know too. So we don't really know anything about that and what the purpose of the flame was.
I just wonder, when they say flames, was it like when a rocket, was it flames coming out of a jet? Was it what kind of flames should we imagine?
Well, that's the kind of thing. If you see a jet in the twilight or at night, you can often see the blue flames out the back of I'm thinking specifically of fighter planes as opposed to passenger jets, but you can see the flames out the back of those things that you normally can't see, especially if they go to afterburners. You get the big flame out the back. But I don't know anything about the propulsion system at all. All I can tell you is this is what was reported. It makes little sense to me because I would think that they would have something more advanced than a chemical rocket to lift off the surface of a planet, but maybe they found that's the best way to do it.
Well, maybe just for liftoff, and then once they're gravity free, then they have a different form of propulsion that they would use.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, we have the blue flames out of our rockets until we get the spacecraft up into orbit, and then they shut it off, and they just hit it when they need to make corrections and things. Maybe that's the best way they found to get off a planet's surface and back to the main ship or something. I don't know.
Yeah, and that would be the same with solar sails, right? I mean, it's a more efficient way of traveling interstellarly, and that seems to be the route a lot of research is going now, and it's the same idea. You're going to use a secondary propulsion system once you're in space and free of gravity. So I do want to talk about before time catches up with us. We still have a little ways to go, but the symbol that Lonnie Zamora reported on the craft. Now, he was told by, was it Colonel Holder? Captain Holder, to retract that from his story for investigative purposes, to find out if anyone else had reported the same thing without their version of the story being influenced by reports of his own. So what did he actually see?
Well, first I would say that I think Holder made a suggestion as opposed to making an order. I think it was a suggestion. Okay. And I make that distinction simply because in the UFO field, as you know, there's a great deal of paranoia. And the idea that Holder ordered him not to mention the symbol is different than suggesting don't mention it, and gave him the reasons. And not only did Zamora agree, but the Lorenzens, who were the great UFO researchers from APRO, thought it was a fine idea as well. But what Zamora saw, and what he drew within literally seconds of the craft lifting off, was an arc with a V underneath it and a line down, so it looks like an arrowhead, and a line across the bottom in red. That's what Zamora drew on the scrap of paper he had, and then a couple of hours later drew for Holder and then signed it. In the files that Mercer found, there were 2 cards. One of them looks like a neater version. Somebody made a handwritten notation, and somebody made a neater version of it. But what it showed there was an inverted V with 3 lines through it, which is also in red. And that was reported in the newspapers. If you go through the Project Blue Book file cases, you can see what I call the umbrella symbol, which is the arc over basically the arrowhead with the line underneath, horizontal line underneath it. That's reported throughout the file. The only place the inverted V with the 3 lines through it is in the subsequent file that Mercer found, but it looks like it's a newspaper report. And if you go back to the newspapers, that's the symbol that's being reported in the newspapers. Ray Stanford, in a letter to Dick Hall in May of 1964, so it's within weeks of the sighting, I think it was within 2 weeks of the sighting, said that if you've got the arc, the umbrella symbol, that's the correct symbol, and the inverted V with the 3 lines through it is the fake symbol, the hoax symbol. In his book, 10 years later, he reverses that, says that the arc symbol is the faked one and the inverted V is the real one. I think the preponderance of the evidence, and this is based on the official Project Blue Book files, and there's a number of people who reported on it, drew the symbol also as in the files. And I think because their expectation was the files wouldn't be released publicly, they felt confident of putting that umbrella symbol in the file. This is the correct symbol, and it seems to be all the way through the files of that until you get to a letter written by Hynek in September. There he's got an inverted V, but he's got a line over the point and 2 lines between the legs, which is not the same symbol that everybody else is talking about. But in another document by I think it was Jenny Zeidman, I forget, but it's reported in the book. Hynek was discussing a lot of these points with her, and he pointed out that what the newspaper symbol was in there, which was the inverted V with the three lines through it. So I think Hynek got confused later on about exactly what the symbol was, but it seems a preponderance of the evidence, and the ones that Zamora signed is the umbrella symbol. And I think given that Zamora signed it, that's the one that's in the Project Blue Book files, the official files. I think that's the symbol that he saw.
Yeah, I think that absolutely makes sense. And then, of course, like you said, the other reason for not sharing certain information, such as the extraterrestrials or beings or whatever he thinks he saw, was to sort of protect his own integrity and to prevent any public shaming and to protect his reputation. What did he actually see?
Let me make a comment here. If he had seen this object in today's environment, the Twitterverse would have exploded. Yeah. And everybody would have an opinion, no matter how uninformed that opinion is. Everybody would have an opinion about what he really saw, what he was really doing, and eventually it would be Trump's fault. Somebody would make that comment, and then somebody would say, "Well, it's really Hillary and Bill's fault," and it would just go off our tangent. But I just wanted to say that because I think it was important that. We discuss, that we make that distinction. Anyway, what he talked about, if you look at the newspaper reports, a lot of them say he just saw white coveralls. He didn't really see any beings. He just saw white coveralls. And I think that was a way of kind of amending what he had seen, because he described it elsewhere. He described them as humanoids. There was clearly something in the coveralls. They weren't floating around. But he doesn't give an elaborate descriptions of what he had seen. But he talks about them being beings. He mentions them being people. Actually, Ray Stanford and I got into an argument about this. Not a big argument about this. That Lonnie Zamora never said people. And I said, I got a transcript right here from the files. The guy's talking to him and he's writing down what Lonnie said. And he says people. And he said, well, do you have a tape? And I'm thinking, I don't need a tape for a transcript if I'm talking to the guy. Anyway, so he talked about them being people. He said they were about the size of small adults or children. So they weren't very big. They were humanoid, 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 head, that kind of thing. Didn't see a lot of features, didn't see a lot that he described. I think part of that lack of description now comes about because of what Burns had said to him about not talking about it. And interestingly, when the Lorenzens talked to Zamora about it, he would describe the beings, and it's in the May 1964 issue of the April Bulletin. There's a long story about Zamora, of course. And when they asked him about the symbol, he refused to talk about that, but he did tell them a little bit about the beings, but he didn't give a lot of description. The other interesting thing about that issue is there's a drawing was made by Rick Baca based on what Lonnie Zamora said. Zamora had gone to the city attorney after the sighting to make sure that he wasn't doing anything that would get him into trouble with the city. And Rick Baca's father was like a paralegal in the office. So Rick Baca, who was only 14 at the time, and something of an artist, draws the object as it was seen by Lonnie Zamora, with the way the landing gear were and all of this stuff. The drawing is shown to Zamora, and he says it's right, and then he takes a pen and he draws the symbol on it. The drawing as it appeared in the Defense or Chieftain, the Socorro newspaper, doesn't have the symbol on it. The drawing as it appears in the April Bulletin does have the symbol on it. So I thought that was kind of interesting, that the symbol was out there. The Lorenzans had a habit of, the May issue of the Bulletin might have come out in July. They were always late on this sort of thing. But they had the symbol on the drawing, and it's the same drawing that Rick Baca had made. I talked to Rick Baca. Yes.
Oh, I was going to ask, what sort of resources did the Lorenzans have to do the investigations that they did? Time and money, etc.
They were investing their own time and money in it.
Yeah.
At the time,
so they couldn't always be there. Split second after an event happened.
They tried when it was an event like this. They tried to either get there later on. They would dispatch field investigators to the scene as quickly as they could do that. But the interesting thing was they lived in Tucson, and I think that they got there Sunday afternoon. Again, the thing took place on Friday evening. They were there on Sunday. They couldn't get there Saturday because they were making arrangements for things that they had to do so they could get out of town and get to Socorro. But they were there within 48 hours of the sighting and talking to Zamora, talking to Chavez, and talking to the people. They tell a story in the April Bulletin about how Jim Lorenzen was in a hallway, and Moody, who was the Air Force investigator, was there, and he was talking to some other people, and Lorenzen was listening in. I mean, they were standing there listening, and Moody says, "Yeah, we got a problem about this Lorenzen woman. She's a nut," with Jim standing right there listening to that. So it gives you an idea of what the Air Force investigator thought of Cole Lorenzen. I knew Cole Lorenzen, and I'd visited him at their home in Tucson and things like that. They believed sincerely in the extraterrestrial explanation of stuff. They were more willing to accept cases of the really bizarre than, say, NICAP was, or the Air Force. With NICAP and the Air Force, if you saw the thing in the sky, that was okay. If you saw it on the ground, well, that's, you're getting a little bizarre. And if you saw something from inside of it, you were psychologically damaged in some fashion for the most part, which is another indication of the credibility of the Socorro case. Is that Quintanilla, who wanted badly to solve the case, couldn't do it, and he had to mark it unidentified. And he said in his own memoirs, the UFO hobbyist would have a field day with this explanation, but he couldn't find an explanation. And if there was a hint of an explanation, he would have jumped all over it. An accurate information, a solid explanation, he would have jumped all over it.
Were they quirky characters, or were they, pretty average?
They were just like anybody else who started an organization to investigate UFOs. They were nice, down-to-earth people. I know that Jim Lorenzen called me one night to dispatch me on a cattle mutilation investigation in Minnesota, which I wasn't delighted about doing because it didn't seem that it was driven by aliens, but something else, and I didn't want to get tangled up with something else. But that's what they would do. They would call their field investigators to have them look at cases. If they found an explanation for a case, they would print it. I had done a story in Saga magazine back in 1976, I think it was, about the Dianzio Yanca case, who was a Argentine, I think, a South American, who had been abducted. And I had gotten the information from the Lorenzans, and after a couple of years, Coral said to me, that case is probably a hoax. So they weren't. They didn't object to labeling a case a hoax if they found the explanation, but their bias tended toward the extraterrestrial. I mean, you can point to a lot of people whose bias lean one way or another, depending on their orientation. So I don't hold that up against them. They devote a lot of time and energy and financial resources to investigating UFOs. And I don't think the April Bulletin paid them all that much money to do the research. I'm sure that they were spending a lot of money out of pocket on their research. And you look at, you can point to any MUFON investigator, well, not to any, but you can point to a lot of the MUFON investigators today who are the same. They're very good, solid people who are spending their own money to do research, hoping to get some kind of answer and proof. And that's where the Lorenzens were.
Okay, well, let's hold it there. We are on the third and final break of Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network, and we will continue the story of Socorro landing in New Mexico. And this case is fascinating because there's so many connections to it, and we keep going down those roads. So hang in there, and we will be right back.
Hello, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Remember, you can take your Inception Radio shows on the go. Just download the Inception Radio Network app for your iPhone, iPad, or Android smartphones and access live shows, past shows, guest lineups, and much more. Just visit the iTunes Store or the Google Play Marketplace and download it today for free.
And welcome back to Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network. I am your host, Alan B. Smith, and my guest tonight is Kevin D. Randle. He's a former Army helicopter pilot and Air Force intelligence officer. And one of his latest of many books is Encounter in the Desert, The Case for Alien Contact at Socorro. So I'm not sure exactly at this point where we left off because we've kind of come in and out of the story. So let's continue with, I think we left off sort of with his description of the symbols, description of alien creatures. And then what was his life like after that? After he had filled out all these reports and he spoke to the Lorenzens, he spoke to Air Force, he eventually spoke to Hynek. Did we even get to that thoroughly?
Well, no, we didn't really. Hynek paid him kind of a left-handed compliment, which was that he wasn't bright enough to hoax the thing. So that kind of suggests the case is solid. He was a solid police officer. Apparently a lot of the students didn't like him because they gave him speeding tickets. And, I mean, and you still see that today,
they were probably speeding.
Yeah. How dare you stop me for speeding when I'm speeding? And give me a ticket, you big mean guy. And one of the things they're saying, well, he liked to have a beer now and then. And I'm thinking, yeah, but he was not a drunk. And I haven't heard that very much, but it's a suggestion that he drank a lot. I didn't really see any evidence of that when I was looking at it. But gee whiz, I think all of us have had a beer once or twice.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. Some people have a couple a day. They come home from work and, that's it. That's it. No big deal.
Yeah. And as military pilots, we periodically had beers and other things as well. But I don't think that's not a disqualifying factor in this, because I don't think there's really evidence. He remained a police officer for a number of years after that, and then he took another job with the city from which he retired. He spent, I believe, and it's not clear in the obituary and any other documentation I can find, but he was a member of the New Mexico National Guard, and I don't know if he stayed in there for the full time to get the pension or not. Mm-hmm. He was a veteran of the Korean War, so he served in the Korean War, and obviously had an honorable discharge from active duty, because I don't think he would have been in the National Guard had he not had an honorable discharge. Mm-hmm. And he would have, at age 60, he would have been able to draw a pension from the Army, and he probably had a pension from the city as well. He seemed to be a very down-to-earth fellow. As I said, a friend of mine was just in town and called him up, and he said, we're having a barbecue, come on out. But we're going to talk about the flying saucer. And I think that was kind of the big bugaboo in his life. There's a guy named Holder and Harden, we get these names mixed up. Paul Harden, who lives in New Mexico, lives in Socorro, and was friends with Lonnie Zamora. and talked to him not long before his death. But Zamora's not Hardin's. And they went out and drove around, and they went out to the scene where the thing landed and talked about it a little bit. And Hardin got another good. He got the story told to him by Lonnie Zamora on the scene and that sort of thing. But it's like 50 years later. But Hardin said that they just sort of talked about it. It wasn't really a directed question and answer session. It was just kind of two guys out there looking around and talking about the events of the past. But Hardin wouldn't tell me much about what Zamora said because he just felt it was between him and Lonnie Zamora. So Zamora would talk about it a little bit to his friends. I think that Zamora, and Sam Chavez certainly thought that it was a black project that he had seen, something that the government was doing and he shouldn't have seen it. And that's really what frightened him, was that there was something about it that being a black project that he should not be talking about. Right. But as I said, and it's important to kind of stress this as well, Quintanilla had a authorization to see anything at Hulliman or White Sands that they were testing. Had a letter of introduction and orders with his security clearances on it, which cleared him to see virtually everything. He could find nothing being tested at Hulliman in Alamogordo or White Sands that matched what Zamora saw and that
was one of the points that Philip Klass was trying to make, right? That was one of his arguments for this whole thing being debunked, besides the hoaxing.
Well, yeah, he thought it was an attempt by the mayor. The mayor supposedly owned the land where the thing landed, and the land isn't worth much. It's worth a scrub. But if a flying saucer landed there, well, they could turn it into a tourist attraction and maybe build a motel, and people could come and sleep on the site of a first contact with alien creatures, or view the New Mexico desert that way. But and that's been reported in any number of books. The mayor owned the land. Turns out that's not true. The mayor didn't own the land. When the tax records were checked, somebody else owned it. So that explanation flies out the window.
Well, I guess my guess is that this was supposed to be, if there was a hoax and the mayor was involved, and I think that would have to mean that Sam Chavez was involved and Lonnie Zamora, and then also would that involve the students of the nearby university to actually pull off what happened, or was?
Well, I don't think you can say the mayor's involved, because there's no evidence for that. The idea would be the mayor would be Zamora's boss. Sam Chavez was the state police, so he wasn't necessarily under the command of the mayor of the city, but Lonnie Zamora would have been. But there's no evidence of that at all, that there's any kind of, and I used the horrid word, collusion between the mayor of Socorro and Lonnie Zamora. The mayor didn't own the land. The idea for the tourist attraction didn't come about until a year later after the sighting, and somebody says, maybe we could make this into a tourist attraction. But Klass threw that idea out. The secondary idea is it was students at the New Mexico, I would say School of Mining. That's not the School of Mining and Technology, something like that. I mean, it's that kind.
These were physics students.
Physics students, and it's college. It's a college, a university type thing, not a high school or anything like that. But the evidence from there is very, very lacking on that as well. And then you have to wonder, how did they pull this thing off? And when you throw in the other witnesses, it kind of takes it out of the thing. Nobody's come forward to really talk about it. A fellow named Tony Bagaglia found a letter from the president of that school, written sometime after he wasn't the president in 1964. Different fellow was, and Hynek talked to him. He says, no, it's not our students. But this Colgate had sent a letter to Linus Pauling saying that it was a hoax pulled off by the students, but didn't really give much detail. In fact, it went to Linus Pauling is kind of irrelevant. Colgate, I think, was a pretty important guy as well. And I always got the impression he did that because it sort of embarrassed him that Socorro was a scene of a UFO landing type thing. But there's really nothing there that suggests it's a hoax. I mean, you just have to wonder how they were pulling it off and that sort of thing. So,
but there wouldn't be a connection between, or a collusion between the students and these two ideas of a hoax. The students doing a hoax on Zamora because they didn't like him because he gave speeding tickets. This is one theory. The other theory is that they wanted tourism, so the mayor would have done that. So these are two theories that are exclusive of each other.
There's no evidence the mayor was in collusion with the students, or the students were in collusion with the mayor. There's absolutely nothing to suggest that at all. There's stuff coming out that suggests that it may have been a student hoax, but the problem is you have no witnesses. So to that, you've got some unidentified sources saying, yeah, we pulled this off, but we don't want our names mentioned. I know from UFO investigations.
And those were the students.
The students, yeah. But I know from investigations that when youngsters, college-age students, do these sorts of things, eventually they cop to it. And I always say, 99% of the UFO pictures were taken by teenage boys. 99% of them are hoaxes. And we've had some wonderful pictures that have been created by teenage boys, and in today's environment, even much more impressive. But the point is, they invariably come out and say, yeah, we did that. And some of the pictures that people have held up for literally decades have been proven to be hoaxes, or admitted to be hoaxes.
Sure. And I think you make a good point in the book that if their end game was to embarrass Zamora, then they would have had to admit it so that people know that Zamora had been had.
Well, that would make it even better, right? Because not only is he reporting a flying saucer and alien creatures, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
He should have been able to tell him.
Yep.
Yeah, that really would have embarrassed him, and it just never happened. And the people who are claiming that it happened that way are people who are not associated with it. The guy Colgate was not at the university. I say university, and the college at the time the events took place. And he said, well, he talked to students who told him about this, but we never get the names of the students who were the participants. And they never said, this is how we did it.
Well, sure. Well, and anyone who's been to school knows that, stories become legend. And, so, a generation, not a generation, but years later, new students come into the school, they hear about the story, and then people start claiming that it was some students from a previous, year or 2 years ago or whatever,
or that they were participants in it. How many people? The best example I have, the funniest one, is at the turn of the last century, that would be 1900, there were 15 guys at 15 separate carnivals saying that they were the real Jesse James. 14 of them had to be lying. That's because that was their claim to fame. I'm the real Jesse James. I don't know how many people have come forward or had come forward and said that they were with the 5 companies at Custer at the Little Bighorn, and they managed to escape the final onslaught of the massacre. I got out of that circle of death somehow. There's no evidence that that's true, but there's any number of people who said that. Was Roswell, and that was one of the things they did in Roswell in the 21st century, was pointing out that here's all these people who have come forward with their tales of having been involved in the Roswell sighting in some fashion that have blown up in our faces. It's clear that they were making this stuff up. And once we got the proper documentation, or we got some other evidence, we realized that they were making the story up, or they began to contradict themselves. In the Socorro case, Lonnie Zamora never contradicted himself. We don't have all these witnesses coming forward and say, yeah, I was there in 1964 and I saw this, that, and the other thing. We have a very solid case. We have a case of a police officer who witnessed the thing. It leaves landing gear markings on the ground, which is a different chain of evidence from the testimony. We no longer say it's single witness. We have 3 witnesses who were not identified by name but had called the police, so we have the documentation for it. We have the Colorado tourists. Granted, that's even worse testimony or evidence than the people who called the police station, because that's secondhand from the gas station manager, and we don't know who those people were. We have other people who were on the ground, saw things in the area that relate to this. So we have a good body of evidence. It's a much stronger, much robust case than it had been as we look at all the evidence that's associated with it.
Well, had anyone called in around the same time that Lonnie saw the UFO?
The 3 people called just prior to him seeing the UFO landed.
And
They called in before he called the police and said, called the station on his radio and says, I see this thing on the ground. So these three people called in and reported it. I think Nep Lopez was the guy's name, the police dispatcher. He didn't write it down because I don't know why. He didn't write the names down. But once the story came out, then that information was corroborated by Holder's report written that very night that these 3 people had called the police station. I am still astonished nobody went to find those people.
Right,
because it shouldn't have been that difficult of a task in a town the size of Socorro, especially when you knew the flight path. And even if you couldn't find those 3 people, you might have found 2 or 3 others that had seen it or heard it.
Exactly, and I'm wondering if I'm confusing cases here, but there was a dispatcher that took those calls, correct?
Yeah, Nep Lopez was the guy who took the phone calls.
Okay, so you have that on record.
That was Holder's is the record that we have for that. Yes, we have that. We have that. We have a record of that documented the night the event happened. It's not like Holder said 10 years later, oh, by the way, I remember Nep Lopez telling us about the 3 phone calls. He wrote it down that very night.
Well, do we know anything about Lonnie Zamora that makes him a credible witness?
He was a police officer. He had police officer training. He didn't seem prone to inventing tales. Anybody can be fooled by the circumstances. The skeptics like to say, well, Lonnie Zamora lost his glasses during the sighting. Yeah, at the very end, after he'd been down close within 30 feet of the object, after he ran back up the hill as the thing began to roar and knocked his glasses off, after he'd seen everything, he lost his glasses. So losing his glasses is irrelevant to the story.
Right, and that also begs the question to me: if it was a hoax, he was really close.
Yes, he was very
close. As a police officer, knowing that there's kids in the area, I'm sure he's experienced his fair share of pranksters. He would have been keen enough to have heard something, keep his eyes out for something, and yet no.
There's Quintanilla, the Project Blue Book chief, said that he always felt the answer was in Lonnie Zamora's head, meaning that there was something there that he observed and that would have given him the answer if Zamora had processed the information properly. I didn't see anything like that. I mean, Zamora seemed to be a very credible source, a very reliable man, maybe not the brightest bulb in the display, but that doesn't mean he was easily fooled either. He was an experienced police officer. He was an experienced military man. And there were they
lived near Air Force bases, so this was not, craft and unconventional craft, but it would have been seen in the sky, I'm sure.
Well, absolutely. And there were the landing traces. To make this thing work, and Lonnie Zamora's down, I mean, the landing traces showed something very heavy being pressed into the ground. Not something light like a balloon or any of the other explanations, but something heavy pressed into the ground. And there is, of course, the evidence from the flame that burned the bush and some of the surrounding test area. If it had been a chemical flame of some kind, it would have left residue that would have been picked up in the samples. And they would have said, oh, we found evidence of gasoline. We found evidence of diesel fuel. We found evidence of propane using to send the balloons, the hot air balloons aloft. There would have been evidence there because it burned the bushes. There would have been evidence of those chemicals there. Nothing like that was found, and there were samples taken by any number of people. And like I said, Holder gave his to Hynek, so the Air Force labs would examine it. But the thing is, you say, well, the Air Force, they would have lied about it. Yeah, they would have lied to the public, but they wouldn't have lied in the files. Because if you look at the files back at that time, they didn't expect anybody to be pawing through them the way we are today. I mean, complete sets of the files, if they had found something and said, oh, well, there's really strange residue found there, we would know it. But the files all suggest everything was mundane. NICAP had samples taken by Ray Stanford that were examined, and the NICAP files came back the same way. The NICAP examination came back the same way, saying that nothing unusual here.
Now, were these, when you say examined, are we talking about spectroscopic analysis or?
All sorts of examinations that they could do, testing to see if they could determine what was what. There was little flecks of the metal were taken to the Goddard Center in the Washington D.C. area to be examined, and found nothing spectacular there. Although, as I talk about in the book, Ray Stanford said he talked to the scientist who originally did the test that suggested there was something extremely unusual about it. But the next time he talked to the scientist, he said no, there was nothing there. But when you put it into the totality of how everything went down and who had samples and who did what, it doesn't seem that there was anything suggestive of any sorts of residue, be it metallic or chemical, that would suggest an extraterrestrial presence or suggest a terrestrial explanation for the damage that was seen.
And I wanted to touch on this one case in particular, where a family had seen, armed with shotguns, or rifles, if I recall correctly.
A little bit of everything.
Right. They were well armed. They had encountered creatures. The family name's slipping my mind right now. Sutton. Okay. And the creatures were this is at nighttime or dusk, I'm not sure. But they're coming towards them. And so tell us a little bit about that.
Well, it's a very complex case because there's a lot of people involved, and it took place over several hours, and there was a lot of shooting involved. What the story is, one of the guys was out in the back at the well, and as he was going back into the house, he saw something land out in the distance and didn't think much of it. And later they saw some little creatures, 2.5, 3 feet tall, really bizarre looking things, frightened them badly. And they were using shotguns and I think a .22 caliber rifle, may have had a pistol or two involved in that. And they would fire at it, would knock the creature down. It would jump up and run off. And they kept surrounding the house. And they would disappear for a while and come back. And so around 11 p.m. that night, I think it was 11 p.m., the family jumped into 2 cars and roared off to the local sheriff's office. The sheriff came back and with military, and they couldn't find any evidence of the creatures. The creatures were gone. They couldn't find the craft. They did find some bizarre residue on the ground, and they found, of course, some bullet holes in the screens and whatnot, suggesting they were firing through the windows at the creatures. The Air Force wrote it off as psychological problems. They said that the family had been to some kind of a Pentecostal meeting and were all wound up in the revival and envisioned this, and they thought maybe some monkeys had escaped from a local circus, and that was what they were seeing. Preposterous explanation. Air Force said originally, we didn't investigate this case, but you go back and you look at that file and you find out, well, yeah, they did. They just did it in a roundabout way so they could say we didn't really investigate it officially. And if the case wasn't reported to the Air Force and they didn't investigate officially, it didn't exist to them. There'd be cases marked information only be a newspaper clipping or something like that. But their explanation was that it was a monkey escaped from a circus, but they could find no monkeys. They could find no circus from which it could have escaped or they could have escaped. That sort of thing. The explanation never made sense. It's a bizarre case.
It is a bizarre story, yeah.
Everybody's thinking, yeah, it can't be true because of all the shooting going on and the reaction of the creatures. And like they're teasing them. He says, oh, yeah, you knocked us down or we fell down, ha-ha on us. And then they would show up again to be shot at. It's really a bizarre case. And, your inclination to say, well, that's not true. The family was bizarre. But, they were dirt poor. Doesn't make them bad people. Doesn't make them prone to hallucinations. There had been no revival meeting that they attended. There was some discussion of drinking, but there's no evidence that they had been drinking moonshine or any of that stuff. They seemed very level. And when the sheriff and his deputies in the military went back that night, they found some evidence that things had gone on, but they didn't see the craft, they didn't see the alien creatures, so they couldn't testify to that, but they could testify to other things they saw that night, which gives it a note of credibility that some of the other cases that we look at don't have. And then, of course, the next morning, some Air Force officer, I think he was on his annual tour, stuck his nose in the case and wasn't very receptive to any idea of alien in landing and that sort of thing. So his reports aren't very good. But when you go back again through the Project Blue Book files on this, you find that they were a little bit more interested in it than they portrayed, and some of the documentation, it contradicts other documentation in the case file. And I think we got to look at all of that stuff. Do you want to believe that alien creatures were playing around that way one night in Hopkinsville, Kentucky? And the answer, my answer is no, not really. I don't believe that. But there's enough in there to just give you pause and say, well, something went on there that was really, really bizarre. And the fact that firearms were involved, suggesting that had it been some kind of a prank played by somebody, there would have been some very unhappy people when the sun came up the next day. And that just doesn't seem to be the case.
What?
The unhappy people, the ones that got shot.
Yeah. In your experience, the Socorro case, I don't know if you take a position on this, but do you believe that Lonnie Zamora did see an actual craft that was not a typical military craft?
If you had gotten the last 20 pages, you would know the answer to that question.
Touche.
But I look at it this way. I know of no terrestrial explanation that fits the facts. Mm-hmm. That does not necessarily lead us to the extraterrestrial. We need something more to get there. Lonnie Zamora's description of the craft and the creatures, the beings, I shouldn't say creatures, I should say beings or things he used, are suggestive that it is not of a terrestrial nature. But that doesn't really get us the evidence. We need something a little bit more substantive to get to that point. That's kind of where I leave it. I can't find a terrestrial explanation. I am not happy about making the leap to the extraterrestrial without additional evidence to support that conclusion, which is a dumb thing for me to say on your program, because now all the people listening say, well, we don't have to buy the book now. But you should buy the book, because you get it all wrapped up in a nice package, and you'll understand exactly where I'm coming from.
Well, sure, and there's tons of detail that is interesting detail that we haven't gotten to, and you make comments and comparisons of other cases in the New Mexico area. I mean, including Kansas, Wichita Falls, and I like how you do compare them because like I had said at the beginning of the show, I think it helps one understand the investigative process in ufology.
Well, what's interesting, I was going to say, I don't mean to interrupt, but what's interesting is I have been criticized for padding the book by putting that stuff in there.
Oh, no, not at all.
And I was thinking, and my thinking was, by doing that is, the case is standalone. We can look at just the evidence on the Socorro case, but these other cases, this other information provides a context for the whole thing. And I think that context is what is important here when we look at the Socorro case. So I thought that information was necessary to take a look at that and give I know one of the people who criticized the book was somebody who's very deeply enmeshed into the Socorro case. Mm-hmm. And into UFOs. So a lot of the information that I provided in the book that I thought of would help people understand it, he already knew because of his own research and the years that he had conducted the research. But there are things in the book that have not been publicized before, but these other cases were important to give a context to the whole thing. And somebody wanting to read about the Socorro case doesn't want to necessarily be dragged into the Arnold sighting, which I thought was important for those who didn't understand ufology and some of the other landing cases where the beings were seen, I think were important to give you an idea of what sort of things are reported by reliable sources and what evidence supports those. There was a landing in Kansas that I thought was important because of the physical evidence left behind and the description of the being. So I thought that information was important to give you a context for the entire case.
Yes, when you first went down that road, I did have a moment of, oh gosh, we're gonna go through the whole history of ufology right now, but but it made sense, and you didn't linger too long on one thing or another, and like I said, it was actually a refreshing read, even though you were recapping some of other well-known stories.
But I also tried to provide, for going into these other cases, and if I didn't go into the depth, I tried to provide the sources so somebody who was interested in that case could follow up on it themselves and see if I adequately addressed it or accurately addressed it, or if I went off on a tangent with those cases. So I tried to provide the information so that you, as the reader, could gather additional information without having to go through all the trials and tribulations I did to get to those points. So, I gave you the websites, give you the names of the books, give you the names of the MUFON Journal or the International UFO Reporter where that information might have been, so you can look it up yourself.
Yeah, and it was a fantastic read. I still have 20 more pages to go, but I'm dead serious. It really is a read, a book worth picking up to read. My guest tonight has been Kevin Randle. Randle, thank you so much for coming on to Paranormal Now. I really appreciate it.
I thought it was more fun than getting dirty.
Yeah, there you go. All right. Well, there's always an alternative. And this is Alan B. Smith for Paranormal Now on the Inception Radio Network, and I want to thank Joe Champion, MJ Lucas, and Bob Tarmac from IRN for making this show possible. And for all of you out there, until next time, live in the mystery. Be well.